So we were sitting at the end of the runway in the run-up area, and the tower called and said, if you can make immediate takeoff, go ahead, or hold short. So I said, we'll hold. I'll let you know. 5 minutes later, I called back and said, okay, we're ready for takeoff, and the tower operator said, Matt's 904, I cleared you for takeoff 5 minutes ago. And I said, yeah, you also cleared us for takeoff last week.
You know, I think I've heard all the Tony Kelly stories, and then you always come up with one more. Do you find yourself in a situation where you're kind of rushed for takeoff? I always feel a good deal of pressure when they say you're cleared for immediate takeoff.
Don't. Relax. The takeoff has to initiate with the pilot. Don't let the controller take control of the aircraft. I could relate many a sad story of people who've been rushed into not only takeoffs, but approaches. Yeah. And we'll cover that a little bit later, but you be the boss.
Okay. I'd like to get down to business here. As you know, I've sold the Baron, the Bonanza. Here, I get them mixed up again. I sold the Bonanza, I have a Baron now. And I find myself in a situation where I'm going to be flying to Southern California quite a bit from here in Denver, and meeting with subcontractors. I'm not current instrument pilot anymore. In fact, it's been 5 years since I've had any instrument instruction. And I was hoping that perhaps we could get together this weekend for a flight from Denver to Palomar, which is near San Diego, as you know. And maybe you could give me some instruction along the way. Is that going to be possible?
That sounds like a great idea, Jack. I've seen your Baron. It looks like it's very well equipped, and instrument flying ought to be a pleasure in that airplane.
Well, I had about a 20-hour checkout in the plane. I've been doing some flying on my own since then. I feel very comfortable in it, but going over those mountains and flying IFR, and I've got to do that with this plane because we've got to utilize the plane. Of course, the insurance company said to get a multi-engine rather than my Bonanza. So anyway, we have it, and I really like it. I brought along some things that I threw in my flight bag that can tell me what I need and what I don't need here. Of course, I have an operating handbook and a little calculator there, and some charts, some flight planning notes, instrument flying handbook. Of course, I got AIM, which you taught me to subscribe to and use all the time, and some brand new JEPS charts here, J-AIDS, and I've got pilot survival manual, which you also told me I needed, and I carry with me. And we need to plan this flight. Got the low altitude flight planning chart. Anything else I need, or is that to do it, or what do we leave home?
I think you've got enough here to get started, Jack. Looks like you came prepared to fly.
Yeah, I am prepared to fly.
Well, I suggest we plan this flight in 3 definite segments.
Okay.
We'll plan the departure first, and then the en route portion of it, and then we'll plan the approach. Now, to get started on planning the departure part of it, the first thing we will need is the low altitude flight planning chart. And as you know, Jack, this is used for planning both VFR and IFR flights below 18,000 feet. Mm-hmm. When we pick up any chart, the first thing we should be concerned with is the effective date. We want to make sure we have a current chart. Then there are revisions on the front of most of the charts, the latest revisions that are in that particular chart. We would probably want to look at those before we do any flight planning. All right, now let's go to the flight planning side of this chart. And we notice that there are some dark lines on the chart. Those dark heavy lines on the airways are the preferred routes. And JEPS also, hand me this book please, JEPS also lists those preferred routes in the en route section of your JEPS manual. And they list them by paired cities. Oh. So you can go from one city to another, and the routing is explained if there is a preferred route. Now, in many cases, there is no preferred route.
Well, looking here from Denver to San Diego area, I don't see a preferred route.
That's correct. So in that case, we file what appears to be the most logical route. And in this case, it looks like it's Victor 8 to Mormon Mesa, and Victor 21 to Paradise, and then radar vectors to Victor 23 Oceanside direct to Palomar, which is the airport you want to go to near San Diego. Mm-hmm. Now, if we plan the preferred route, it makes it easier on us and on the controller. And when you get your clearance, it'll probably read cleared as filed. Now in this case, we're going to file one that is not a preferred route, but it looks logical. If ATC accepts that routing, we will still be able to get cleared as filed. It's a lot better than having to copy a complete new routing at the end of the runway. So always
Almost
look.
anything is.
Yes, always look to see if there is a preferred routing.
Okay.
Now, a few more things we can learn by looking at this planning chart. One is there are some dashed lines along the route that we have chosen.
I see 3 just in the short segment there.
Those dashed lines indicate that the MEA on that segment is above 12,500 feet. Now, FAR 9124 says that you must have an encoding altitude reporting transponder above 12,500 feet. So we know we're going to need that, and you have one. And FAR 9132, Jack, prescribes the use of oxygen by the crew in an unpressurized aircraft such as yours. Now, we can also discover from looking at this chart that we're going to need en route charts 9 and 10 and 3 and 4. Now, another thing, the MEAs on this chart are fairly high. If you should lose an engine in your Baron, we will have to drift down carefully to the service ceiling of the aircraft. And that will probably be around 9,000 or 10,000 feet, lower than the MEAs. So here's where planning an out in advance could pay big dividends. And we'll cover that more carefully during the en route portion of our planning.
Good, because I'm concerned about that.
All right, let's take a look at the other side of this chart, and we find a mileage chart.
There's Denver.
Okay, now let's try to find the distance between Denver and San Diego.
Okay.
Okay, here it is, 738 miles. Now, Jack, that's airways. I'm sorry, that's direct routing. Now, we're going to be flying airways, so we'll add about 10% to that. And that'll give us 800 plus miles. Your Baron, with the extra tanks that you have in it, has a range of over 950 miles. So, if we don't have strong headwinds, we can file nonstop all the way to Palomar. And incidentally, we'll file an alternate there, even though the weather is going to be VFR.
Oh, well, now wait. Why file an alternate if we don't have to?
Well, for several reasons. The main reason we're going to do it is for the practice of doing it and finding out when we have to file an alternate and what the alternate requirements are. But you know, in foreign countries, nearly all the other countries in the world require that pilots file an alternate every time they file an IFR flight plan.
I didn't know. Do you always file?
Well, even in this country, Jack, Part 135 and the airlines, in their company manuals, require an alternate every time there is they file an IFR flight plan.
That's my question again. Do you always file an alternate?
I wish I wouldn't push that, but no, I don't always file an alternate. As most pilots, I don't. However, I try to always file an alternate when the weather requires that I file an alternate. Because remember that the alternate is for lost communications purposes. And although we have redundant equipment in our aircraft today, if we should lose communications and we haven't filed an alternate when we should have, and the weather is down, we have no out. And ATC has no idea what we're going to do, and neither do we. So it's a good idea to always file the alternate.
Okay.
Now, let's talk a little bit now about the weather briefing. Now, the FAA, along with the aviation community, has come up with several of these little pamphlets which they distribute through the Accident Prevention Program. This one is entitled How to Obtain a Good Weather Briefing. This, along with examogram number 19, Telephone Weather Briefing, assures that you will get a thorough weather briefing and won't forget important items.
I haven't read an examogram since I was studying for my, I think it was my instrument years ago. They still have those?
Oh yes, there are 2 volumes, VFR examograms and IFR examograms, and these were developed because the FAA discovered that there were certain questions, either on an oral exam or written exam, that people were having a little bit of trouble with these questions. So the examogram explains that subject in greater detail, and they're very nicely done. I recommend everybody get both the VFR and the IFR examograms.
Okay,
and you can obtain them from your local government bookstore or even your FBO, or if you have to, you can write to the government printing office. Now, at the end of this briefing, Jack, I'll give you a list of some of these pamphlets and the address from which you can get them.
I'd appreciate that because I really need to get up to speed on a lot of this stuff.
Okay, one more thing on this chart this is the planning chart now, before we put it away, and that's the winds and temperature aloft forecast locations. Now remember, the FSS has these locations by identifier only, so when we're telling them from which stations we want this information, we should give them in the identifier to speed things up. And here's another case where you want to take control. If you don't tell them which ones you want, they will give you a lot of stations and you're wondering, should I write this down? Is it any good? So keep control. So what we'll do here then is we will ask them for the winds aloft at Grand Junction. Well, first we'll start with Denver, then Grand Junction, Bryce Canyon, Las Vegas, Ontario, and San Diego. Now, when you first talk to the briefer, give him this information and try to give it in this order because he has a form on which he will put the information. Tell him whether you're a VFR or IFR flight. Give him the aircraft number and the type. And the point of departure and your destination, the route and the altitude that you're requesting, the estimated departure time and the estimated time en route. Now,
Sounds almost like a flight plan.
well, it is almost, but there's no need to be precise because we're really not flight planning at this time. This is just information so he can give you a better briefing. Okay? And once again, I stress you take charge of the briefing. And one of the best ways to do that is to follow the information as it is given in this How to Obtain a Good Weather Briefing. And you'll notice that there's one summary here of the pre-flight briefing. There is also a go, no-go decision chart in here. And when you get down to the very last box on this chart, you can decide whether you want to go or not based on your own limitations. Now, the flight plan forms, there are many of them. There's the FAA flight plan form, and JEPS has flight plan forms, which they put in all of their manuals, and they're very well done. But the FAA has put out a flight planner with a flight plan form and a flight log on it as well. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the flight logs. Not all pilots use a flight log, but they're very valuable to you. Now, the one in the flight planner is probably as good as any for the average pilot to use. As you can see on this flight planner, we have a copy of the FAA flight plan form. There is the flight log, some fuel management boxes down in this corner, a place to copy your clearance. On the back side is a weather chart and a place to copy en route weather as well as terminal weather, the winds aloft forecasts, NOTAMs and SIGMETs and all the rest of that sort of thing. And down at the very bottom is a no-go checklist again. Very good form. Okay. Now, the synoptic sketch, Jack, at the top of this form, the instructions in the manual that came with this suggest that you copy the lows and the highs and the fronts, and I always find that difficult to do over the phone.
You've obviously never seen any of my drawing. It gets pretty ragged.
Mine too. So, in lieu of that, I try to pick up a copy of the latest paper. Usually the weather map in the paper is about the same size, so I cut it out and I paste it over this chart. Now I have more information in a few seconds that he could give me in a half an hour over the phone.
It's got wind directions and fronts and rain and snow.
Yeah, it's very thorough. So that's one way of getting some advance information. Another, of course, would be to listen to AM weather in the morning before you go. Okay, now the next thing that I think that we will be concerned with the briefer would be NOTAMs, because many times you have to ask for these NOTAMs. They're not given to you voluntarily. You might have to ask also for PIREPs, that is pilot reports. Top reports, sometimes the briefer doesn't know what the top of the clouds are. Then you can help too by giving FSS this information as you're climbing out. You might have to ask for freezing levels, temperature dew point spread, and again, you want to make sure that you ask for NOTAMs. Now, these NOTAMs are kind of a mystery to the average pilot, I think. So let's first of all define a NOTAM as it is defined in the AIM. Okay? The AIM says that NOTAM information is that aeronautical information that could affect a pilot's decision to make a flight. It includes such information as airport or primary runway closures, changes in status of nav aids, ILS and radar availability, and other essential information. Now, there are various types of NOTAMs, and if you read Section 294 in the AIM, it discusses 3 of these types.
Well, I've read that, but I can't remember the 3 types.
Okay, well, the first one is the more general one. It's the FDC NOTAMs, and they are regulatory in nature. And they're transmitted by the National Flight Data Center, and they're sent to all the FSS stations. Then there's the NOTAM-D information, and this is disseminated for all navigational facilities that are part of the national airspace. Now, this information is distributed automatically and appended to hourly weather reports. Think of that D as meaning the information will be sent a long distance from the affected site. Now, normally, Jack, we'll be made aware of NOTAM-D information in the briefing. But if you're going to fly more than a few hundred miles, you might not get NOTAM-L information. I know of pilots who flew over 500 miles and when they arrived found the runway was closed. So it pays sometimes to make a telephone call to the destination airport. You see, NOTAM-L information is distributed locally only and is not attached to the hourly weather reports. NOTAM-L information for other FSS areas must be specifically requested directly from the FSS that has responsibility for the airport concerned. Now, NOTAM-L information includes such information as taxiway closures, men and equipment on or near the runways, lighting aids that don't affect IFR flying, and temporary airport and runway closures. Well, Jack, would you hand me your Airways manual, please?
Sure.
I'd like you to notice here under chart NOTAMs, and these are replaced about every 2 weeks, the latest chart NOTAMs. Gives you the changes in your airway charts, and it gives you the changes on the approach plates. Now, let's take a look here under California, San Diego, and the only NOTAM we have here refers to the Miramar Naval Air Station. Doesn't pertain to us. So apparently there are no NOTAMs that will affect us here. But always check that. Now, the NOS has a separate book with those changes listed. So if you use NOS, be sure and check with that book. Now, there are no NOTAMs there, as I said, for our area, and the weather is supposed to be clear for the first 1/3 of our flight, and then it'll be IFR to about the Las Vegas area. There are no SIGMETs or AirMETs involved, and the winds are northerly, at about 10 knots out of the northwest. Now, let's take a look at the flight plan form. The FAA flight plan form is fairly self-explanatory, but I'd like to give you some reminders as we look at this form, and when you're reading it to the briefer. Let's talk about some of these blocks. Block number 3. Here they want the aircraft designation and the equipment designator, the equipment code. So in your case, you'd put down B55/R because you have RNAV capability. They like you to put down the highest capability you have, even though you may not be using it for that flight. Okay, the next block that I'd like to talk about is block number 6, the estimated departure time, and they want that in GMT, not local time. Okay. Now, one thing to remember about that, that's a proposed off time, and if you're not going to get off by that time, remember that the computer will drop the flight plan 1 hour after that. So you have 1 hour to update the flight plan and keep it current.
Okay, the Z here means Zulu time, GMT.
That's correct.
Okay, for both of those.
That's correct.
Proposed and actual, all right.
Now, the next box, cruising altitude, just put down the initial altitude. It may be a rather low altitude and you know you have to go higher. Put down the initial altitude. You can request changes en route, or more likely, ATC will assign new altitudes above the MEAs to you. Okay, the next block I'd like to talk about is block number 9, destination. They would like both airport and city in that block. And block 10, estimated time en route. It's not a big thing and there's not a lot of difference here, but it's better to put down the estimated time en route to the initial approach fix. The only reason that this box is here is if you lose communications, you have to hold at the initial approach fix until the estimated time en route has elapsed, or maybe you were issued an expect further clearance time. But if you weren't issued the expect further clearance time, then having put in this box the entire approach time means you'd have to sit there and hold that much longer.
I see.
So it's not a big deal, but it's better to put the initial approach fixed time there.
So in this case, if we say like 5 hours, 5 hours, no minutes, and I get my actual Zulu departure time, then I had 5 hours of that, and that's when I could then shoot my approach if I'd lost communications.
That's correct.
Okay.
Remember, if you arrive early, you have to wait,
Yeah.
but if you arrive a little later, you can just go right into your approach. We'll talk about that a little bit more in another briefing. Now, let's refer to Block 11, the remarks column here. You can put anything in there that you wish to pass along to ATC. For instance, if you're coming in from outside the country, you might put ADCUS, ADCUS, which means Advised Customs, and FAA will pass that message along. Another thing might be no SIDs if you don't desire to fly the SID or don't have one with you.
Or no stars.
No stars.
Yeah.
Anything at all that's pertinent that you might want to pass along. Okay, now let's take a look at column 13, the alternate airport. It's a good idea to file an alternate anytime you file IFR, although, as you know, it's not absolutely necessary.
Mm-hmm. Now, I remember talking with you recently, and you said something about 1-2-3 rule.
Oh yes, and regarding the alternate airport?
Yeah.
Yes, they've simplified the rule considerably over what it used to be, and now I call it the rule of 1, 2, 3. If at any time, 1 hour plus or minus your ETA, the weather is forecast to go below 2,000 feet AGL, or the visibility below 3 miles, then you must file an alternate.
Okay. What about the alternate weather forecast? What's required there?
Okay, that hasn't changed a whole lot, Jack. As a matter of fact, the same rule of thumb exists, and that is that if there's a precision approach at your alternate, it must be forecast to be, just at your time of arrival there, it must be forecast to be 602.
Time of arrival at the alternate.
At the alternate.
Yeah.
602. If there is not a precision approach, if it's a non-precision approach, then it must be 802. And of course, if there's no approach, it must be VFR weather, and you must be able to get from the en route structure to the airport in VFR conditions in that case.
Okay.
Now, remember too that in some cases, the airport will not be authorized for an airport as an alternate. In that case, it'll just have a big NA in the alternate column. Would you pass me the chart again, please? Sure. I just want to show you that on the airport side of the JEPS charts, there is for filing as an alternate block, and it will give you the minimums for filing for your type of aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
Now, your Baron now, maybe your Bonanza or the other aircraft you had may have been an A aircraft, but the Baron is a B aircraft. So when you're looking in this column, or in the approach column for that matter in many cases, look under the B for your type of aircraft, and those will be your minimums for either destination or alternate.
All right.
Now, the NOS handles that just a little bit differently, and they put the alternate information in the front part of the book. And you know to go to the front part of the book because on the chart itself, on the approach plate, there will be a small A in a triangle. That will refer you to the front part of the book, and you'll find the same information that JEPS puts on the airport side of their charts. Now, note one more thing, Jack. On the bottom of the FAA flight plan is a reminder to close your VFR flight plan. Normally, we don't think about closing our IFR flight plan, but there are cases when you have to close the IFR flight plan, and we'll get into that in the approach segment of our briefing.
Fine.
Okay, now, Jack, I'm going to ask you to come up with the vital statistics for this trip, and one easy way to do it is to use a calculator like the Avstar. It makes it simple and easy to figure. And then, along with that, if you use a flight log similar to the flight planner that the FAA puts out, it has several advantages. By using this flight log, you're able to keep up with your trip and see how well you're doing. As a matter of fact, when we were flying the ocean, we used to have a form similar to this that we called a how goes it. And we could tell how far behind or ahead of our flight plan we were at any particular time. And this is valuable because you might have to start planning a gas stop that you hadn't planned on before. Now, Another thing good about these logs is that you're going to be flying this trip over and over again. You won't have to make it out every time. As a matter of fact, you could make out one log without the additional information on it, and make copies of it on your copier, and then just keep using it and filling in each one as you go.
Because I'm going to be going to that San Diego area at least once a month,
Sure.
if not more.
And then you will gather information here on the actual performance of your aircraft. And since it's fairly new to you, that'll be valuable information. Now, although these forms are good, I always prefer to design my own.
Tony's is better, sure. I should have known that.
Yes, and you can put anything, any additional information that you want on there.
Well, I'll just Xerox this and put in jacks.
Sure, anything. You can do that if you like. Now, you can save these plans, put them in a folder, and they'll be valuable to you later on. All right, Jack, if you'll go ahead and figure up the stats for this particular flight.
Okay. Okay, Tony, you can check these over with me. On the calculator here, I figured we'd burn about 106 gallons of fuel, which is 636 pounds. That includes our climb, cruise, and descent, of course. We'll need another 45 minutes reserved for a total of 120 gallons. If we top the tanks, we'll have about 16 gallons extra for holding and alternate routing. Now, I didn't figure the time to our alternate because the weather forecast for Palomar is severe clear. But I did file Montgomery Field 30 miles south as an alternate.
Very good. You know, speaking of alternates, Jack, we're all familiar with the fact that sometimes it's required that we file an alternate airport for our arrival. But sometimes it's a wise idea to plan a departure alternate as well. Part 135 manuals and, of course, airlines, in the company manuals, they'll have provisions for this. And it's a good idea for all of us to follow that procedure. And the way this would work is if the weather's anywhere near minimums at your takeoff, plan an alternate departure which has fairly good weather conditions and not too far away, within an hour's flight time. And if anything happens and you can't return to your departure airport, then go to your departure alternate, which you've already pre-selected and maybe have already set up some of your nav aids so that you can make the approach immediately. For instance, Jack, here at Denver today, either Centennial Airport or Jeffco Airport would be good choices. You see, they both have ILS approaches. Now, the next thing I think we ought to do, Jack, is organize the cockpit.
Sounds like a good idea.
So many people end up with a lot of cockpit clutter, charts and so forth all over the place.
Kind of like this table here.
Yes. Now, here's the way I would like to, I like to organize things. I use just a plain ordinary clipboard. You can use whatever you want. There are some things on the market that are rather exotic, but the clipboard does it for me. And the way that I organize it is in the order of use. Now, for instance, today we'll put the 11-1 airport side of the Denver chart first, then the Denver airport taxi diagram next, the SID, Denver 7 departure, and then the area chart for the Denver area, and then the 9 and 10 en route chart, which we'll be using right after takeoff. Now, in addition to that, on the very bottom of the stack, I'll have extra charts, our departure alternate airports, and other approaches for the Denver Stapleton Airport. That will be on the bottom of the stack. If we need them, then we don't have to go looking for them. They're handy for us to get to and use them immediately.
Sounds like a good idea.
Now, in addition to that, if you'll hand me the manual, I'll show you something else here. In addition to that, I have some dividers that help me locate my charts quickly and easily. Now, one is the departure divider, and I'll put that here where the departure plates are. Just let me take it out and show you this. And on the departure divider is a checklist for an instrument takeoff. Now, this does not take the place of your checklist for your aircraft, but merely for the instruments. And you can use a grease pencil on it. It's laminated, and use it over and over again. Now there's such things on here as the comm setup, presetting the comms, and a note for an emergency return to the airport if need be. All of my V-speeds are down here and I can review them just before takeoff. My accelerate and stop distance has been computed and logged here, and the single engine climb rate. In addition to that, I have a lineup checklist so that I don't forget any last minute items if the tower kind of rushes me. And that'll remind me to set my bug on the runway heading or set your directional gyro, your fuel selectors, your fuel pumps if you need them, and a reminder if you need that you may need ice protection, and to turn on your transponder and check to see that it's on the proper frequency. Then a takeoff time. Now, most people don't bother with the takeoff time, but it would become important to you if for some reason you lost communications en route. Now, I use the same procedure for the approach. Now, when I get to the place en route where I need the approach plates, I merely turn to them, and here they are. They're easy to find. And I have a checklist here which will help me spread the workload so that many pilots get all bundled up with a lot of work at the last minute as they're trying to capture the localizer. All the way from the point where you can first tune in the ATIS, about 15 or 20 miles out, the workload is spread out by segments of the approach. Also, this will help you to check every item, and you won't forget something important this way.
Very good.
Now, Jack, did you realize that most IFR flights, that is outside of the pay-for-hire group, are actually being conducted illegally?
Over 50%? Most?
That's right, over 50%.
I can't believe it.
Yes, it's true. If you'll take a look at this examogram entitled, "Is My IFR Flight Legal?" And under pilot requirements here, it says that an instrument pilot to be current must make 6 approaches within the last 6 months and have logged 6 hours of instrument time. And most of them, especially out west where there's good weather all the time, have not done that. Now, if you haven't done that, you can take an instrument competency check and have it written off by a flight instructor, and you're good for another 6 months. Of course, you're good indefinitely if you keep meeting the requirements. Now, under airplane, the VOR check. It's required that the VOR check be logged every 30 days. And you don't have to keep a log for years and years back, as long as you have the most current log, but less than 30 days old, and it must contain all of these items on the log. A lot of pilots don't do that, so that makes the flight illegal. And another thing is what we were just talking about, an alternate airport. Many times when an alternate is required because the weather is low, they don't file an alternate. Not a big deal unless you lose communications, and then where would you go? Where would FAA expect you to go? Nobody knows. So those things make the flight illegal, as well as Part 91 says that you must know as much as possible about the particular flight, and that includes the performance of your aircraft. Now, normally, most people who have flown the aircraft for some while can pretty well estimate what the performance will be under normal circumstances. You can even estimate what your weight and CG might be. But when things are a little bit unusual, well, like here, for instance, at Denver today, we're at a high altitude airport, we're near gross weight, a fairly warm day. So we had better go to the charts in your aircraft owner's manual and figure out what our performance will be today. As a matter of fact, Jack, Airmanship Incorporated produces these weight and balance plotters, and they'll make one for your particular kind of aircraft. It makes figuring the weight and balance much easier and more accurate.
I know I used this computer to calculate our weight and balance, and we're about 200 pounds under gross, a bit forward on the CG, but well within the envelope.
Very good. Did you figure any of the other data at that time?
Yeah, I've computed takeoff distance to be around 2,000 feet, and we'll be able to clear a 50-foot obstacle at 3,200 feet. There should be no problem. Runway 26 left is over 10,000 feet long. Accelerate stop distance I have at 4,500 if we abort at 84 knots. The two-engine rate of climb, full power VY speed, clean, should be around 1,250 feet per minute, and a one-engine climb gradient will be about 1%, which converts to slightly over 100 feet per minute.
Well, as you can see, Jack, the single-engine performance is greatly reduced at this altitude. The FAA, through their accident prevention program, has this handout called Always Leave Yourself an Out, written by your old buddy, Richard Ahrens. And even if the weather is VFR like it will be today on our takeoff, you should figure an out. What would you do if something unexpected happened?
Sure.
For instance, today we could, if we lose an engine, we could turn right and land on runway 17 right. The other airports around Stapleton are at a higher altitude, so we probably would want to return to Stapleton as long as it's VFR. Now, the next thing I think we should do, Jack, is take a look at the airport side of Denver, Colorado's plate 11-1. Now, if you'll notice, Jack, the plate is divided into sections. The first section being the heading, then the airport plan view, which is drawn to scale, the additional runway information, then the takeoff and IFR departure procedures. In addition to that, down at the bottom is the information for filing the airport as an alternate airport. Now, these plates are indexed in the book by city alphabetically within states. Now, the frequencies are listed in the communications box in the order in which they are normally used. Now, notice, Jack, the small CPT within parentheses. This means that they would like you to get your clearance prior to taxi. However, it's not mandatory. If you don't want to comply with that, you can taxi out and ask for your clearance at the end of the runway. But then you might find you've got a delay. This should be a big red flag to you that there's a possible delay here, so call for your clearance without cranking the engines up, probably. And they will tell you, they will give you your clearance, but at the time they issue the clearance, they will also issue a time to expect departure. So now you can shut down or just sit there with one radio on and listen for your number to come up. Now, the departure frequency on the will show on the SID. We have a departure frequency, and for our direction of flight today, it will be 123.85. That will, as I say, will show up on the SID as well as being on this chart. So you may not get that with the clearance. At the larger airports, this is normally the procedure. You don't get that frequency with the clearance. Now, there's also a CTAF frequency listed, and people have a question about that. That means that's the common traffic advisory frequency, and you often see that where towers are not operational continuously. Up at the top of the left-hand top corner of the chart is the longitude and latitude. And this is great for people who have the inertial guidance systems and so forth. And right alongside of that is the RNAV location of the airport. And if we're not using our RNAV for anything else, let's set that RNAV information in before takeoff. Then if we have to make a fast return to the field, we can switch the RNAV information on and quickly get back to the vicinity of the airport. In case visibility is bad, that really helps. Another facility we have on the airport at Denver is a VOR test facility. If you haven't logged a VOR check within the last 30 days, we can do this anywhere on the airport. It might be a good idea if we do it anyway for practice. Now, the field elevation at Denver Stapleton is 5,333 feet. That is the highest usable portion of the airport. Now, there are a lot of small notes around the chart, so it's a good idea to read these notes in the flight planning stage because they might be awfully difficult to read on a dark, rainy night. There is one note here that would pertain to our flight, and that is the low-level wind shear alert system that Denver has. There are a handful of airports around the country that have these.
And we need more, as a matter of fact.
Yes, because as you know, Jack, wind shear can be just as dangerous on takeoff as it is on final approach. Witness the New Orleans disaster. Now, in nearly every case, though, with wind shear, whether it's landing or takeoff, the pilot could have accomplished the maneuver safely had he only waited a few minutes. So don't be rushed into a takeoff. And if there's any doubt at all, just wait it out. The obstruction heights that we see here are in mean sea level, so you can relate that to the elevation of the airport. Now, the exact runway heading is given to you by the JEPS charts now, not just the nearest 10 degrees. So for those people that don't have slave gyros, they can get a real accurate heading, set a real accurate heading just before takeoff. Also, the elevation in the run-up area for each runway is given. And it just happens for the runway that we will be using today, which will be runway 26 left, the elevation at the run-up area is 5,333 feet. Now, one way that you can use that, Jack, is to set your altimeter at 5333 and then check the Colesman window reading against the ATIS altimeter setting.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, on my flight plans, I have an area down here where I enter that. I call it the altimeter correction factor. Let's say that today I find there is a plus 0.04 error between ATIS and my altimeter when I set the field elevation. For the rest of the day, or at least for the rest of this flight, I will set 0.04. I will add that to every altimeter setting I get, and I'll have a more accurate altimeter setting, especially useful on landings and minimal landings, where the weather's right down to minimums. Now, on some airports, as you know, which are unattended and don't have ATIS, setting the altimeter to the airport elevation is about the only way you can get an altimeter setting. There's a bar scale on here also. JEPS changed that just recently, but most pilots don't use it for anything. May I suggest that one way that you can use this, since you have a new airplane, is to note landmarks along the airport runway on which you will either be landing or taking off. And in the first instance where you're taking off, as you lift off the ground, note a landmark. Then later on, when you have time, apply the bar scale to that and see how far down the runway your aircraft traveled before it took off. Likewise, on landing, when you land and let the airplane roll out, even though there's not a turn-off point at the point where you could comfortably turn off, note a landmark, and now you'll know how much runway your airplane normally needs to land properly.
I've never given it any thought. That's
yes,
another good idea.
That chart does have some good uses. Now, Jack, let's go to the bottom part of the chart, the takeoff and IFR departure procedures. This part of the chart was changed in November 1982, but there are plenty of examples of the old format in the book yet. But it's a good idea to get familiar because there's a lot of good information here. Now, 26 left and 26 right, under 26 left and 26 right here, the A and B category aircraft. Okay, your Baron now is a B aircraft.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
You knew that. Okay, so whenever you see B category on the chart, those are the minimums that will apply to you. Okay, now we understand that in Part 91, a pilot can take off 00 if he wants to. Not a very good idea, but if you want to, you can. For other people, there are restrictions, and they're listed here. Now, the restriction for the A and Category B aircraft, on runway 26 left and 26 right, is one RVR, that is a runway visual reading of 1/6 or 1/4 of a mile. The standard for two-engine aircraft in the United States is RVR 50 or 1 mile. Now, the reason we have the lower minimums is because Denver Stapleton has special lighting so that you can take off under lower conditions. Over on the far right under category A and B is the note Other, and 1002 is listed there. This means that if you cannot meet the climb requirements, which are listed here, then you should not take off unless you have 1002. Now, the reason for that is, if you can't make the climb requirements, then you should be able to see the obstructions and avoid them that way. The climb requirements that are listed here under category A and B is a minimum climb of 250 feet per nautical mile to 7,000 feet. Now, that's about 1,700 feet AGL. Of course, Jack, this climb requirement expressed in feet per nautical mile is a gradient, and we must convert that to feet per minute. And we can do this. JEPS helps. For instance, on the SID chart, there will be a table, and you can find the ground speed. We have to do this with ground speed. The ground speed that you will be using on the climb, or you may have to interpolate, and it helps you convert that to feet per minute. Now, in addition to that, JEPS provides this gradient to rate table. And it's a good idea to take a highlighter and go down the column, which would be the ground speed that you would be using on the climb out. And then when there's a feet per nautical mile requested, we can find it in the left-hand column, come back across the page to that ground speed, and find out how many feet per minute you have to climb. In this case, for instance, the 250 feet per nautical mile at 140 nautical miles per hour, 140 knots in your aircraft, converts to 583 feet per minute that you would have to make good in order to comply with this requirement. Of course, Jack, you have to remember that if you lose an engine, there's no way that you can comply with that requirement, that climb requirement. So again, plan it out before you take off.
Well, that sounds like a good idea. I noticed that not all charts have this minimum climb rate gradient. What criteria is it that dictates that?
Well, Jack, it's defined in this manual, Terminal Instrument Procedures for the United States, or TIRPS for short. It's also described and explained in the AIM in Section 325. Now, here is a depiction of the obstacle identification surface. You see a slope of 152 feet per nautical mile, starting no higher than 35 feet above the end of the runway, is assessed for obstacles. The chart is predicated also on a climb of 200 feet per nautical mile, or approximately 400 feet per minute in your bearing. Now, if no obstacle penetrates this surface, this 40-to-1 surface, the IFR departure procedures are not published. Now, if some obstacle does penetrate the surface, and out west it does this quite often, then obstacle avoidance procedures are specified. Now, these procedures may be sealing and visibility to allow the pilot to see this obstacle, as in other on the departure side of the approach plate. It might be a climb gradient if it's greater than 200 feet per nautical mile, or detailed flight maneuvers, or a combination of these. Now, in some cases, the IFR takeoff may not be authorized at all from some runways. And the AIM states that each pilot, prior to departing an airport on an IFR flight, should consider the type of terrain and other obstacles on or in the vicinity of the departure airport. And he must determine whether a departure procedure and/or SID is available for obstacle clearance. He must determine if obstacle avoidance can be maintained visually, or that the departure procedure or SID should be followed. He should determine what action will be necessary and take such action that will assure a safe departure. Now, that puts the responsibility for a safe departure squarely on the pilot in command. Now, we've looked at the SIDs. Let's take a look at the IFR departure procedure on the bottom of the airport side of the chart. You'll find this IFR departure procedure on just about every airport that has an approach, an instrument approach. Now, if you follow this departure procedure, it will get you safely from the airport to the en route structure without running into any unexpected or unlighted objects, and you could use it even on a VFR flight at night out of a strange airport. It's almost as good as a SID. Now, the NOS charts provide this same information, Jack, in the front of each of their instrument approach procedures booklets under the title IFR Takeoff and Departure Procedures. Now, let's take another look at the SID. Some airports have many SIDs. Now, Reno, for example, has 6 SIDs. Oakland, California has 8. Some large airports have only 1. For instance, Chicago O'Hare has only 1. And Denver has only 1, the Denver 7 departure. The SID number changes whenever there is a significant change in the departure procedure. That change will always be noted at the bottom of the page on the new SID that comes out. Incidentally, after number 9, they start over again with number 1, so that you'll never find a number 10 departure. Now, the SID serves many purposes. It provides a visual pattern to aid the pilot to the en route structure. It keeps the communications frequencies clear and keeps the conversation to a minimum. It provides a course of action in case of lost communication, and it provides the pilot with an advanced information on the departure procedure. It also provides for obstruction clearance during the IFR departure. Now, there are two general types of SIDs. There is the vector SID and the pilot nav SID. Now, the AIM states that the pilot nav SIDs are established where the pilot is primarily responsible for navigation on the SID route. Some pilot nav SIDs may contain vector instructions which pilots are expected to comply with until instructions are received to resume normal navigation on the filed procedures. Vector SIDs are established where ATC will provide radar navigation guidance to a filed route or fix depicted on the SID. But remember, if you don't want to use a SID or if you don't have one, so indicate in the remarks column of the flight plan.
I sure will. I've got a couple concerns, Tony. I've never flown a multi-engine plane on an instrument departure. And I'm wondering, from your background and experience, what are some of the things I should really be looking for?
Well, you're right to be concerned about that, Jack. I know that you've recently had 20 hours of training in the twin, and you're prepared for mechanical failures like engine quitting on takeoff. But now you have to be concerned also with flight instrument failures during takeoff. You know, in California in the last few years, I've experienced 5 failures of the artificial horizon just during training. If you're not prepared for that kind of failure the first minute after takeoff, you could find yourself back into the ground before you realize what the problem is.
I read a lot about accidents where that's happened. You know, people just fly right into the ground. That's one of the things I'm concerned about. Another thing is on our en route. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Jack, that you know the first minute of takeoff is the most crucial of the entire trip. And airmanship has made 2 tapes. The first minute of takeoff, the first minute of flight multi-engine, and the first minute of flight single engine. And I think if you obtain a copy of one of those tapes, it will answer your question.
I certainly will. Another thing that concerns me is that along the route that we've planned, there are MEAs that are higher than the single engine service ceiling of my Baron. What are we going to do about that?
Well, you're right to be concerned about that, and it should weigh heavily in your go, no-go decision making. And we're going to address that situation in the next segment of our briefing, which is the en route section, and we're ready to tackle that now.
I'm looking forward to it.